Thank you all for coming back, and I apologize for the delay in getting my second story out. I'm still working on it, trying to make it just right. Please give it a listen and let me know what you think in the comments below. Well, let's get into it. Here we go. In the quiet town of Kiel, Wisconsin, where the forests stretch for miles and secrets linger in the shadows, something ancient has awakened. Whispers of missing hikers and mutilated wildlife reach the ears of Sheriff Tom Harlan, who turns to an old friend for help. Dave, a seasoned hunting guide, gathers a team of skilled outdoorsmen to track whatever is lurking in the woods. As they delve deeper, they uncover signs of a creature beyond their worst fears, a predator with intelligence and power unlike anything they've faced. With every step, the team finds themselves drawn into a web of danger, mystery, and the primal terror of being hunted. Their only hope lies in a late arrival, Andy, a cryptid expert with scars to prove his battles against the unknown. But even he might not be prepared for what awaits in the darkness. Chapter 1: A Sheriff's Plea. The scent of cedarwood and gun oil lingered in the small hunting lodge as Dave packed up for the day. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, sending flickering shadows across the mounted trophies lining the walls. He had just finished organizing a weekend hunt for a group of out-of-town businessmen when he heard the sound of tires crunching over the gravel outside. He glanced out the window and frowned. It wasn't a customer. It was Sheriff Tom Harlan, his old friend. The sheriff looked older than Dave remembered, his usual confident gait replaced with a slow, deliberate walk. Dave opened the door before Tom could knock. "Sheriff, everything all right?" Tom tipped his hat, his expression grim. "Not exactly. Mind if I come in?" Dave gestured him inside. "Coffee's fresh. What's going on?" Tom sat heavily in the nearest chair, running a hand over his face. "We've had 3 people go missing in the last 2 weeks. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. And last night, a farmer found his cattle torn to shreds. Whatever did it wasn't a wolf or a bear." Dave leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "What makes you think it's something else?" Tom hesitated. "Tracks. Big ones. Too big to belong to anything I've seen before. And there's something else." He pulled out his phone and slid it across the table to Dave. The screen displayed a blurry photo of a massive footprint in the snow. It was easily twice the size of a man's boot, with deep grooves where claws had pressed into the earth. Dave stared at the image, a chill creeping up his spine. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I need someone who knows these woods better than anyone, and someone who can keep this quiet," Tom said. "You've led hunts in every corner of these forests. If anyone can track this thing, it's you." Dave hesitated. "And if it's just a bear?" "Then we'll call it a bear," Tom replied. "But if it's not," Dave sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, but I'll need a team. I'm not going out there alone." Tom nodded. "Take whoever you need, just find whatever's out there before someone else goes missing." Dave stood in the lodge long after Tom had left, staring at the photo on the sheriff's phone. It wasn't just the size of the print that unsettled him, it was the shape. Something about it felt wrong. He shook off the thought and started making calls. If he was going to do this, he needed the best people he could trust. The next morning, Dave stood outside the lodge, waiting. The sun was barely up, and the frost on the grass sparkled like shattered glass. His breath formed clouds in the cold air as he heard the familiar sound of a truck rumbling down the driveway. Kyle was the first to arrive, stepping out of his battered pickup truck with military precision. He wore a tactical jacket and carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. "Dave?" Kyle said, his tone brisk as he shook Dave's hand. "You didn't say much over the phone. What's going on?" "I'll explain when the others get here," Dave replied. "But let's just say this isn't your average hunting trip." Kyle raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. He'd learned in the Marines that sometimes it was better to wait for the full briefing. Next came Rich, his old hunting buddy. He pulled up in an old SUV, stepping out with his usual unshaven look and a rifle case slung across his back. "Morning, boys," he said, grinning. "I hope this isn't another one of Dave's wild goose chases." Kyle smirked. "If it is, at least I'll have backup this time." Before Dave could respond, the hum of an ATV cut through the crisp air. Josh appeared on the trail, his gear strapped down with military-like precision. He hopped off and waved. "Am I late?" Josh asked, pulling off his helmet. "Right on time," Dave said. "Let's head inside." Once they were seated around the lodge's large wooden table, Dave laid out the situation. He passed around the photo from Tom's phone, watching their reactions closely. Rich let out a low whistle. That's no bear. Josh frowned, leaning closer. The shape's off. Whatever made this is walking upright. Kyle stayed silent, his sharp eyes scanning the photo. Finally, he looked up. You're not telling us everything, are you? Dave sighed. Sheriff wants this kept quiet, and I don't want to jump to conclusions. But whatever's out there, it's dangerous. We've got missing people, shredded cattle, and tracks that don't match anything we've seen before. We're going to need every skill we've got to figure this out. There was a moment of silence before Rich spoke up. So, when do we start? The first step was to gather supplies and plan their route. Dave knew the woods like the back of his hand, but he wasn't taking any chances. He assigned Kyle and Rich to scout ahead while Josh set up monitoring equipment. As they loaded up their gear, Dave couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the tree line. He glanced over his shoulder, but the forest stood silent and still. For now. Inside the lodge, the team continued gearing up. Josh sat at the table, tinkering with a handheld device that looked like a cross between a radio and a GPS. The faint hum of static filled the room as he adjusted the settings. "What's that?" Rich asked, leaning over his shoulder. Josh grinned without looking up. "Motion detector." "Well, sort of. It's rigged to pick up heat signatures and movement within a 50-yard radius. Not perfect, but better than relying on just our eyes." "Fancy toys," Rich muttered, "but can it shoot?" Josh smirked. "It tells us where to aim. You can handle the shooting part." Kyle, sitting near the fireplace, cleaned his knife with practiced efficiency. "We need more than gadgets," he said. "This thing, whatever it is, won't go down easy if it's tearing apart cattle like Dave says." Dave nodded. "That's why we're bringing enough firepower to take down an elephant. Kyle, I need you and Rich to scout the area near Deep Creek. That's where the tracks were found. Josh and I will set up sensors and cameras along the eastern ridge." Kyle gave a curt nod. "What about Andy? This seems like his kind of thing." The room went quiet for a moment. Dave exhaled and ran a hand over his face. "I called him. He's tied up with something right now. Said he'd join us as soon as he could." Rich raised an eyebrow. "Tied up with what? The guy practically lives for this stuff." "I didn't ask," Dave said, his tone final. "Andy's got his reasons. When he shows up, he'll be ready." Kyle exchanged a glance with Rich but didn't press further. The group spent the next hour sorting their gear. Kyle checked the condition of their firearms, ensuring every rifle and sidearm was clean and functional. "This isn't a weekend hunt," he reminded the others. "Double-check everything. If we run into trouble, we won't have time to fix a jam." Josh packed his bag with spare batteries, cables, and a small laptop. "We're going to need to triangulate the movement of whatever's out there," he said. "If it's smart, it'll avoid us. We'll need to outthink it." Rich loaded extra ammunition into a tactical vest, or we'll just outshoot it. "Don't underestimate it," Dave said. He stood near the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. "This thing's smart enough to stay hidden all this time. That means it knows these woods better than we do." Kyle stepped forward, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Then we'll be smarter. Let's move." As the team headed out, the lodge door creaked shut behind them, and the forest greeted them with an eerie silence. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they split into two groups, the weight of the hunt settling over them. Dave glanced back at the lodge once more before stepping into the woods. Somewhere out there, Andy was preparing in his own way, and when he finally showed up, Dave had a feeling they'd need him more than ever. Initial exploration. The woods stretched endlessly, the towering pines casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Dave and Josh moved methodically, their breaths visible in the cold air. Josh had his motion detector in one hand and a camera slung over his shoulder, while Dave carried a rifle, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. "Nothing but squirrels and rabbits so far," Josh muttered, glancing at the device. "Keep looking," Dave replied. "Whatever left those tracks isn't going to walk right up to us." The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of a branch in the wind. Dave's years in the woods had taught him to listen, to pick up on the subtle signs of life, or its absence. Today, the silence felt unnatural. "Got something," Josh said suddenly, his device emitting a faint beep. He crouched, adjusting the settings. Dave stepped closer, gripping his rifle. "What is it?" Josh frowned. "Heat signature, about 30 yards ahead. Could be a deer. Or it could be watching us." They moved cautiously toward the signal, every step deliberate. When they reached the spot, Josh held up a hand to stop Dave. He pointed to the ground. There, pressed into the snow, was another massive footprint. Josh knelt down, studying it. This one's fresher than the one in the photo. Whatever made it is close. Dave scanned the trees, his pulse quickening. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. Mark the location, he said quietly. Let's move. Scene 2, a mysterious event. As night fell, the team regrouped at their base camp near the edge of a frozen creek. A small fire crackled in the center, it flickering against the surrounding darkness. Kyle and Rich returned from their scouting mission with tense expressions. We found more tracks, Kyle reported. Same size, same shape, but there's something else. Drag marks. Whatever it took was heavy. Cattle, maybe? Dave asked. Maybe, Rich said, but I've never seen a bear drag something like that. Josh was setting up his sensors around the perimeter of the camp when his device suddenly lit up, emitting a shrill beep. What's that? Rich asked, reaching for his rifle. Something's moving, Josh said, checking the display. 50 feet out, east side. The team froze, their eyes darting to the tree line. Dave motioned for everyone to spread out, that weapons ready. The beeping grew faster as the movement drew closer. Then silence. Josh checked his device again, his face pale. It's gone. Whatever it was, it just stopped. That's not possible, Kyle said, his voice low. Nothing that big just disappears. A sudden crash echoed through the woods, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. The team turned toward the noise, rifles raised. Over there, Rich shouted, pointing his flashlight into the trees. The beam illuminated a torn piece of fabric hanging from a low branch, stained with something dark. Beneath it, the snow was disturbed, as if something had thrashed violently. Dave picked up the fabric, his stomach twisting. This isn't animal blood, he said grimly. It's human. The fire crackled behind them, but none of them felt its warmth. Somewhere in the darkness, something was watching. Waiting. Scene 3. The close encounter. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the unknown pressing down on the team as they moved cautiously back to the campfire. The torn fabric in Dave's hand felt heavier than it should, like a warning from the darkness. Eyes up, Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. It's out here. I can feel it. Rich's flashlight swept the tree line again, the beam bouncing off the snow and casting jagged shadows. A branch snapped somewhere behind them, and the team spun around, weapons aimed. Show yourself, Kyle barked, his voice commanding despite the tension. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the woods, so low it seemed to vibrate in their chests. Josh's motion detector lit up again, the display flickering wildly. It's circling us, Josh said, his voice trembling. Dave held up a hand, signaling the team to stay calm. Stick together. Back to the fire. They moved as one, their backs to each other as they stepped into the flickering ring of light. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, from the shadows, a massive figure darted between the trees, too fast to get a clear look. Rich fired a shot into the darkness, the sound shattering the quiet. The crack of the rifle echoed through the woods, followed by the thud of something heavy hitting the ground. Did you get it? Josh asked, his eyes wide. Rich shook his head. I don't know. Before they could investigate, a deafening roar filled the air, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The team froze, their weapons trembling in their hands. Back off, Dave shouted into the night. The roar faded, and the woods fell silent once more. Whatever was out there, it had retreated. For now. Kyle exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. It's testing us, figuring out what we can do. Dave nodded. And we're not ready for this. Not yet. Scene 4. Andy's arrival. The roar had barely faded when headlights appeared on the horizon, cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. The rumble of a heavy-duty truck echoed down the trail, and the team turned toward the sound. The truck came to a stop just outside the camp, and a figure stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette illuminated by the headlights. About time, Rich muttered, though relief was evident in his voice. Andy slammed the door shut and approached the group, his presence commanding. He carried a large duffel bag over one shoulder and a shotgun slung across his back. Looks like you've stirred up quite the hornet's nest, Andy said, his tone calm but serious. Dave stepped forward, gripping Andy's hand. Glad you could make it. We've got tracks, missing people, and something that's way too smart for its own good. Andy dropped his bag by the fire and unzipped it, revealing an assortment of weapons, traps, and gadgets. Whatever it is, It's hunting you as much as you're hunting it. Good thing I've dealt with things like this before. Kyle raised an eyebrow. You're saying you've fought something like this? Andy nodded, his expression grim. Not just fought, survived. Josh leaned closer to examine the gear. What are we dealing with here? A bear? A wolf? Something worse? Andy looked into the fire, his face shadowed by the flickering light. If it's what I think it is, then it's smarter than any predator you've ever faced. It doesn't just hunt for food, it hunts for sport, and it won't stop until we're either dead or out of its territory. The weight of his words settled over the group. Dave cleared his throat. Then we'd better make sure it's the one that doesn't make it out. Andy smiled faintly. That's the plan. But first, we need to set a trap, and we need to do it fast. Scene 5. Planning the trap, Andy crouched by the fire, spreading a map of the surrounding area on the ground. He tapped a spot near Deep Creek with a calloused finger. This is where we'll make our stand, he said. It's a natural bottleneck, thick trees on both sides and rocky terrain. Whatever we're dealing with will have limited escape routes. Kyle leaned in, studying the map. How do we draw it in? Bait, Andy replied simply. Rich crossed his arms. Bait? Like what? A goat? Not quite, Andy said, glancing at Dave. We'll use ourselves. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Josh broke the silence. You mean we're going to just sit out there and wait for it to come to us? Andy nodded. Andy did. We'll set up a decoy camp. It'll look like we're unguarded and vulnerable. Meanwhile, we'll be positioned with traps and weapons ready to ambush it. Dave frowned. And if it doesn't fall for it? It will, Andy said, his tone unwavering. Predators like this can't resist an easy target. The trick is making sure it doesn't realize it's the prey until it's too late. Kyle tapped the map. All right, what kind of traps are we talking about? Andy reached into his duffel bag, pulling out coiled wire, tripwires, and a strange device that looked like a modified bear trap. This, he said, holding up the device, is a reinforced snare, designed for large animals, but it should hold if we get it around one of its legs. Josh examined the snare with interest. How do you know this'll work? Andy's gaze darkened. Because it's worked before. Scene 6. A frightening revelation. The team spent hours preparing the decoy camp and setting the traps. As night fell, they took their positions, hidden in the underbrush and armed to the teeth. The decoy fire crackled cheerfully in the center of the fake camp, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. They waited in tense silence, every creak of the forest setting their nerves on edge. Then, just as the moon reached its peak, they heard it, a low growl, followed by the snap of a twig. It's coming, Andy whispered through the radio. The growl grew louder, and a massive shape emerged from the darkness, its glowing eyes fixed on the decoy fire. It was taller than any of them had imagined, its hulking form covered in thick, matted fur. Hold, Andy said, his voice calm but firm. The creature sniffed the air, stepping closer to the bait. Then, without warning, it froze, its head snapping to the side as if listening to something. What's it doing? Rich muttered. Andy's face tightened. It's not alone. From the opposite side of the clearing, another figure appeared, just as massive as the first. Two of them? Josh whispered, his voice barely audible. Stay calm, Dave said, gripping his rifle. The two creatures moved in eerie synchronization, circling the decoy camp. One of them sniffed the air again, then let out a deep, resonant howl that echoed through the forest. Andy's radio crackled. Pull back, now. Before anyone could move, a third howl answered from deeper in the woods. There's more, Kyle hissed, his grip tightening on his weapon. Andy's voice came through the radio again, sharper this time. Fall back, they're not taking the bait. The team began retreating carefully, trying to avoid triggering their own traps. But the creatures were already on the move, their heavy footsteps crunching through the snow as they closed in. Run, Dave shouted. The team broke into a sprint, the growls and howls of the creatures growing louder behind them. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees. They barely made it back to their real camp, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The howls faded into the distance, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. Andy was the last to arrive, his expression grim. This isn't a hunt anymore, he said, setting down his gear. This is a war. Thanks for listening this far. I truly appreciate it. Please hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps me out. Scene 7, regrouping and strategizing. The team sat around the campfire, their faces pale and drawn. The warmth of the flames did little to chase away the cold fear that had settled over them. Josh broke the silence first, his voice shaking. There's more than one. How are we supposed to deal with that? Rich shook his head, still catching his breath. I didn't sign up for an army of these things. One, sure. Two, maybe. But three or more, that's a death sentence. We're not quitting, Dave said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kyle, ever the pragmatist, leaned forward. We need a new plan. What worked for one isn't going to work for a group this coordinated. Andy nodded, his jaw set. They're working as a pack. That howl we heard? It was a signal, probably to call reinforcements. These things are smart, and they know the terrain better than we do. If we don't adjust, we're not going to make it out of here alive. Dave rubbed his temples, trying to think. All right, Andy, you've dealt with cryptids before. What do you suggest? Andy opened his duffel bag, pulling out a roll of detailed maps. First, we need to figure out their territory. They won't follow us too far out of it. They're territorial. If we can find the borders of their range, we can plan better. Josh looked skeptical. And what if their territory includes this whole area? Then what? Then we make them uncomfortable, Andy said. He pulled out several small canisters marked with warning labels. These are deterrent grenades. Non-lethal, but they'll make a hell of a lot of noise and light. Most animals hate them. It might not scare them off permanently, but it'll buy us time to regroup. Kyle examined one of the canisters. So we force them into an area where we have the advantage. Something open, where they can't hide or flank us. Exactly, Andy said. We set up choke points, traps, and fallback positions. We won't just be hunting them, we'll be forcing them into our game. Dave stared at the maps, his finger tracing the contours of the terrain. There's an old quarry about 3 miles east. The area is open and the walls are steep. If we can lure them there, we might stand a chance. Rich frowned. You're talking about baiting them again. How do we make sure it works this time? Andy looked at him, his expression serious. We use something they can't resist, something they'll see as a real threat to their dominance. What's that? Josh asked. Andy's gaze shifted to the group. Us. The room fell silent again as the weight of Andy's plan sank in. Dave finally broke the silence. If we're going to do this, we need to make sure we're prepared. Ammo, traps, fallback routes, everything. We don't get a second chance. Kyle stood, his expression resolute. Then let's get to work. The team spent the next few hours refining their strategy. Andy took charge of mapping the traps and choke points, his knowledge of tactical combat shining through. Kyle and Rich focused on weapon readiness, double-checking every firearm and stocking up on ammunition. Josh worked on setting up a network of cameras and motion sensors to monitor their movements and give them an early warning system. Dave coordinated the effort, making sure everyone stayed focused. Despite the fear hanging over them, the team felt a sense of purpose. They weren't just reacting anymore, they were planning, fighting back. As the fire burned low, Dave glanced at Andy. You think this will work? Andy stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. It has to. Scene 8, setting the stage. The trek to the quarry was grueling, the cold biting through their gear as they hauled equipment and supplies through the snow. By the time they reached the site, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the open expanse. The quarry was exactly as Dave remembered. Steep walls that created a natural amphitheater. The rocky terrain littered with boulders and sparse patches of snow. It was both a blessing and a curse, perfect for funneling the creatures, but with limited escape routes if things went wrong. We'll set up here, Andy said, dropping his pack near the quarry's edge. This high ground will be our fallback point. If they push us this far, we'll have the advantage of elevation. Kyle and Rich began unpacking their gear, laying out rifles, grenades, and ammunition. Josh worked quickly to place motion sensors around the perimeter, his fingers numb from the cold. Traps go along this line, Andy said, pointing to a narrow path leading into the quarry. They'll funnel through here, so we'll have the best chance to hit them hard. Dave nodded. And the bait? Andy glanced at the decoy setup they'd prepared, a small fire surrounded by scraps of fabric and food wrappers to mimic a careless campsite. It'll do the trick. These things are territorial. They won't ignore the chance to take out intruders. C9. The execution. By the time darkness fell, the team was in position. Dave, Kyle, and Rich lay prone on the high ground, their rifles trained on the entrance to the quarry. Andy was stationed further back, overseeing the traps and fallback strategies. Josh monitored the motion sensors from a makeshift console hidden behind a cluster of rocks. The first sign of movement came just after midnight. A soft ping echoed in Josh's headset, and he leaned into his console, his heart racing. "They're here," he whispered into the radio. Dave adjusted his scope, scanning the entrance. At first, there was nothing but shadows. Then a massive figure emerged, its silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of the decoy fire. "Target in sight," Dave murmured. Behind it, two more figures appeared, their movements synchronized as they approached the bait. "3 confirmed," Josh reported. "Wait," Andy said through the radio. His voice was calm but firm. "There's more." A fourth creature emerged from the shadows, followed by a fifth. Kyle exhaled sharply. "5? Are you kidding me?" "Hold your positions," Andy ordered. The creatures circled the decoy fire, their massive forms dwarfing the rocks around them. One of them sniffed the air, its glowing eyes scanning the area. "Do they see us?" Rich whispered. "Not yet," Dave said, though he wasn't sure. Then, with a sudden roar, one of the creatures lunged at the decoy fire, scattering the fake supplies. It howled in frustration, realizing it had been tricked. "Now!" Andy shouted. The first trap triggered, a reinforced snare snapping around the leg of the largest creature. It let out a deafening roar, thrashing against the restraint. The others turned toward the sound, their growls rising in unison. Kyle and Rich opened fire, their bullets finding their marks. The creatures roared in fury, tapped scattering as the team's ambush unfolded. Dave took aim at one of the smaller creatures, his shot grazing its shoulder. It let out a pained howl, but kept moving, darting toward the base of the quarry wall. "They're trying to flank us," Josh shouted, watching the motion sensors light up. Andy pulled a grenade from his belt, tossing it into the path of one of the advancing creatures. The explosion lit up the quarry, momentarily stunning the pack. "Fall back to the high ground," Dave ordered. The team retreated carefully, covering each other as they climbed to the elevated position. The creatures regrouped below, their glowing eyes locked on the humans. "They're not retreating," Kyle said, his voice tight. "They won't," Andy replied. "Not until one side is dead." Scene 10. The Turning Point. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the guttural growls of the creatures. Dave's rifle bucked against his shoulder as he fired at the largest one, its eyes glowing like embers in the night. The snared creature was still thrashing below, yanking at the trap with terrifying strength. Andy lobbed another grenade, the flash illuminating the quarry and sending one of the creatures scurrying for cover. "Keep firing! Don't let them get too close," Rich cursed under his breath as his rifle jammed, quickly switching to his sidearm. "These things don't quit." Suddenly, the largest creature freed itself, snapping the reinforced snare with a terrifying display of power. It let out an earth-shaking roar and charged up the slope, its massive strides closing the distance in seconds. "Move," Andy shouted, firing at its legs to slow it down. The team scrambled back, retreating toward their fallback point. The creature stopped just shy of the ridge, its chest heaving as it stared them down. It howled again, and from the shadows below, the remaining creatures gathered around it. "They're regrouping," Kyle muttered, reloading his rifle. "No," Andy said grimly. "They're learning." The creatures stood together for a moment, their glowing eyes locked on the team. Then, as if on some unspoken command, they melted back into the shadows, leaving the quarry eerily silent. Scene 11. The Aftermath. The team stayed on high alert for hours, scanning the tree line for any sign of the creatures. When dawn finally broke, the pale light revealed the full extent of the chaos. Torn ground, scattered traps, and the remains of the decoy camp. "They could have finished us," Dave said, breaking the silence. "Why didn't they?" Andy slung his shotgun over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Because they don't need to. They've already proven their point." Josh frowned. "What point? That they can scare us? That they're in control," Andy said. "They let us live so we'd understand that this is their territory and we're trespassing." Kyle kicked a shattered snare, frustration etched on his face. "Great. So now what? We just pack up and leave?" "We report to the sheriff," Dave said, his voice firm. "He needs to know what we're dealing with. These things aren't just animals. They're organized and they're dangerous." Andy nodded. But we don't stop there. This isn't over. If we don't figure out a way to deal with them, it's only a matter of time before someone else gets caught in their path. Back in Kiel, the team gathered in the sheriff's office, their faces drawn and weary. The sheriff listened intently as Dave recounted the events, his expression growing graver with every word. "So you're telling me there's a whole pack of these things out there?" the sheriff asked, his voice low. Dave nodded. "At least 5, maybe more. And they're not afraid of us. If anything, they're testing us." The sheriff rubbed his temples. "This is way above my pay grade, Dave. What do you suggest we do?" Andy stepped forward. "First, you lock down the area. No hikers, no hunters, nothing. Then we start documenting everything. Tracks, sightings, any evidence we can find. The more we know about them, the better chance we have of stopping them." The sheriff sighed heavily. "I'll do what I can, but if word gets out about this, we're going to have a media circus on our hands." "That's why we keep it quiet," Dave said, "for now." Back at Dave's cabin. The team returned to Dave's cabin that evening, the weight of the past 48 hours hanging over them. They sat around the fireplace, the crackling flames a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. Rich broke the silence. "So what now?" Andy leaned back in his chair, his face shadowed by the firelight. "Now we prepare. They're not going to stop, and neither are we. If we're going to survive this, we need to think like them. Use their tactics against them." Josh nodded slowly. "And if we can't?" Dave looked around at his team, his friends. "Then we find someone who can." The cabin fell quiet again, the only sound the wind howling outside. Despite their exhaustion, none of them could shake the feeling that the battle was far from over and that the creatures were out there, watching, waiting for their next move. Scene 14. Revelations by the fire. The fire in Dave's cabin crackled softly, casting warm light on the team's weary faces. Despite the comfort of being back in familiar surroundings, a thick tension hung in the air. Andy sat near the fireplace, sharpening a hunting knife, his expression distant yet focused. Kyle broke the silence first. "All right, Andy, you've been holding out on us. It's pretty clear you've seen stuff like this before. Spill it." Andy paused, his eyes lifting to meet Kyle's. "You're not wrong," he said simply. "I've spent years tracking creatures like these. Some people call them cryptids. I call them predators." Rich leaned forward. "Wait, years? How? Why?" Andy slid the knife into its sheath and leaned back. "Let's just say I've had my fair share of run-ins with things most people don't believe in. It started in the Rockies when a hunting trip went wrong. We thought it was a bear attacking our camp. It wasn't." Josh frowned. "What was it?" Andy's gaze turned sharp. "Something like what we're dealing with now. Bigger, meaner, and smart enough to outthink us at every turn. I was the only one who made it out of that mess. After that, I made it my mission to understand these creatures, to figure out how to fight them." Dave exchanged a glance with Kyle. "So, you've killed one of these things before?" Andy nodded. "I have, but it wasn't easy. And it sure as hell wasn't pretty. These things aren't just animals. They're intelligent, they adapt, and they don't forget." Rich let out a low whistle. "No wonder you didn't flinch out there." "Doesn't mean I'm not scared," Andy said, his tone somber. "Fear keeps you alive. But what I've learned is that fear alone won't save you. Strategy, preparation, and knowing your enemy, that's what gives you a fighting chance." Scene 15. The Bigfoot Mysteries. Josh crossed his arms. "All right, Professor Cryptid, if you're such an expert, what's the deal with these things? Why are they out here? Why haven't they been caught or exposed before?" Andy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, different names, same legend. They've been around for centuries, always staying just out of reach. Some say they're relics of an ancient species. Others think they're something else entirely." "Like what?" Rich asked. "Like a predator that's evolved to survive in ways we can't even imagine," Andy replied. "Think about it. How many times have hunters, hikers, or campers gone missing in the wilderness? People write it off as accidents, animal attacks, bad weather. But what if it wasn't?" Dave frowned. "You're saying these things have been hunting people?" Andy nodded slowly. "Not all the time, but when they feel threatened or hungry. And the scariest part? They don't leave evidence. They know how to cover their tracks, literally and figuratively." Kyle tapped his fingers on the table, his mind racing. "So why are they showing themselves now? Why attack us instead of just staying hidden?" Andy's expression darkened. "Territory. Something's changed out here, something big enough to push them to act. Either their range is shrinking or something's threatening their dominance. Whatever it is, they're making sure we know this is their land. Scene 16. Strengthening the team. The team sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Andy's words settling over them. Dave finally spoke, his voice steady. All right, so we know what we're up against, but we're not giving up. If we're going to survive this, we need to trust each other completely. Rich nodded. No lone wolf stuff. We work as a unit, or we don't work at all. Kyle smirked. Lone wolf? Rich, you're the one who ran off during the last hunt because you thought you heard something. Rich rolled his eyes. And I was right. I saved our butts with that recon. Enough, Dave said, holding up a hand. This isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about staying alive. Josh leaned back in his chair. Fine, but if we're trusting each other, we need to know where we stand. Andy, you're obviously the expert here. What do we do next? Andy leaned forward, his eyes sweeping over the group. We stop thinking like prey. These things may be smarter than the average animal, but they're not invincible. They have weaknesses, just like anything else. We find those weaknesses, exploit them, and turn the tables. And how do we do that? Kyle asked. First, Andy said, we study their patterns. They're creatures of habit. They hunt, patrol, and communicate in specific ways. Second, we upgrade our gear. No more relying on standard hunting rifles and makeshift traps. I have contacts who can get us specialized equipment. Thermal scopes, high-frequency sound emitters. Reinforced traps. Rich raised an eyebrow. And you just happen to know guys who sell this kind of stuff? Andy smirked. You'd be surprised what's out there if you know where to look. Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the story so far. Until next time, keep searching for the truth.